Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is Mark Sampson. I'm Director of Development at the Reformed Presbyterian Theological Seminary, and I welcome you here today to our continuing webinar series. It's a delightful day here in western Pennsylvania. Kind of reminds you of creation, and what do you know? Happens to be part of our topic for today. Our guest lecturer today is Professor C.J. Williams, and commonly known as Rabbi here by our students at the seminary. Professor Williams is a distinguished scholar of Old Testament theology, and he's also a well-known Hebrew scholar. He's a dedicated family man and an avid outdoorsman, and he grows really good beards, by the way. Our topic for today: an exegetical consideration of creationism from a Hebrew language perspective of Genesis. Now, I know that sounds pretty heady, but not to worry. Even if you don't know your jot from a tittle, there's plenty here for you today. And we'd like to thank our friends at RP Missions. They make these webinars possible every month. Today's webinar is recorded, so if you need to leave for some reason, you can come back to the RPTS website, and we will make sure that we have a link and you can listen later at your leisure. Again, as a reminder, any questions during the webinar, use that chat box in the lower left-hand corner of your screen, and we'll give you a hand. So, without any further ado, here is Professor Williams.
Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for tuning into this webinar. It is good to be here, good to be doing this subject, and I'm glad you've taken time out from your day to join us, and I hope that this will be a good and edifying time, good use of your time on a day like today. Mark mentioned what a beautiful day it is, a good day to be enjoying creation, but we are going to be talking about it. So I just give you a warm welcome. Thank you for tuning in. The topic of the webinar may be a tad bit misleading. This isn't going to be a Hebrew lesson today. We're simply going to consider some points of why Genesis 1 and the creation account is so critical to the faith and the life and the witness of the church. And also go over a few reasons why the historic view of Genesis 1, that is a perspective that sees the structure of it being a literal 6 sequential 24-hour days, is a view that still commends itself in light of the many options out there today and the many challenges out there today, not only from outside of the church, but also the plethora of perspectives that have arisen inside the church as well. What about this view of 6 days of creation and a literal perspective on that? We're going to be talking about that subject in particular. We will delve into some Hebrew a little bit, but not too much. I realize not everyone has a Hebrew background or Hebrew studies under their belt, so we'll take that into account. And it is an enormous topic. Certainly nothing we could really finish in a 1-hour webinar. But what follows here are just some initial thoughts. I think will encourage you to think a little more, maybe study a little more. So one man's perspective. I have some views that have been forged on this matter out of some study, but it's a topic of particular interest to me. And so I look forward to it. I look forward to your questions later on in the hour as well. So if you have any of those, keep them in mind and make sure you get them to me. Okay, well, let's dive right into it, and we'll begin. Let me advance the frame here and begin. I want to begin with the question, why is our view of creation important, of the creation account important? Why even begin here? Why begin with a question like this? Well, it may seem that perhaps in the church today, with the multiplicity of views on Genesis 1 and the creation account, that we've somehow gotten to a point where we agree to disagree, and there are several different views that are just accepted as normative in the evangelical world, and we have differences. And to some degree, that's expected. We agree to disagree on quite a few things. But creation itself, Genesis 1, is something that is just not one more among many issues. It's really foundational. As I point out here just in 3 bullet points, it's foundational to our worldview. It's not only the starting point of the Bible, it's the starting point of our thinking about everything. It is the grand presupposition of the Christian faith. It begins in Genesis 1:1 that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and Genesis 1 proceeds to tell us how and exactly the Lord did that, and that is where our thinking begins, and where the Bible begins, we begin. Hebrews 11 mentions that by faith we believe the Word of God framed the worlds. And so it really is foundational to just about everything else. So to have a clear and solidified and unified even perspective on what Genesis 1 teaches is critical for our worldview. The basis of critical doctrines, maybe that's an obvious point to make, but think about just beyond creation and the origin of our world and ourselves. You have the doctrine of God, which begins in Genesis 1. Doctrine of man, doctrine of sin and redemption also make their appearance in Genesis 1 through 3. So many things have their beginning here. Everything has its beginning here, but so many of the critical doctrines that we believe have their genesis in Genesis 1. So once again, our view of this text is vitally important to our worldview and our perspective on many different doctrines. Thirdly, it's integral to our witness. I think we have to remember that God's creatorship is part of our declaration to the world, and that we don't only proclaim a Redeemer God, but a Creator God, and that the gospel itself begins in Genesis 1:1. If you think about the apostles in the book of Acts, how their different evangelistic scenarios they found themselves in, when they spoke to Jews, primarily they'd begin with Abraham and David and the covenant, and they would latch on to those things that would resonate with that group. But when they spoke to Gentiles, when Paul was in Greece and in other places, he begins with creation as the starting point of the gospel. And I have a few examples up there on the screen for you to think about. One in Acts 14, where Paul was in the certain scenario where he was presenting the gospel after a notable miracle. A crowd wanted to sacrifice to them, and he stopped them from doing so, and he began to present the gospel of the Lord to them. And he began with creation, the creator of heaven and earth and the sea and all the things that are in them, and how he left himself a witness in the world, in the created world, giving us rain from heaven and fruitful seasons and so on. So he begins with creation. In Acts 17, it's quite the same setting. This is Paul in the Areopagus. And when he had occasion to present the gospel there, once again, he started with creation. So it is vitally important to our witness, to the world, and the gospel itself. And I think we ought to consider how it weakens our witness, perhaps, if we have a fractured witness to creation or an apologetic witness to creation. It was the church father Augustine who said that creation is the greatest miracle besides the resurrection of Christ. And so this is one of God's greatest works, as something that we need to proclaim in our witness and in our worship. This mighty act of God with a measure of real conviction, and to see it not just as an academic squabble, but something that really does affect the faith and life of the church. So that's why ask the question, and why continue to think about this issue rather than simply be satisfied with disagreement. So it's something that we all need to strive to think about and to continue to think about. And I think we will find fruit in our faith if we do that. All right. Well, let's move along to the next frame here, and the purpose of Genesis 1. It's good to step back and think about the purpose of this text before we try to dive into it and answer the question, what is it? What is its purpose? And I have here simply, the purpose of the text is so that we would understand, and italicize, underscore that word, understand, so that we would understand how God created the world, and by that understanding have comfort and hope. Now, I reference Romans 15:4 here. Let me read that to you briefly. It's worth reading because it's a magnificent verse, and it gives us a perspective on all of Scripture, really. But let's bring that perspective to Genesis 1. Romans 15:4 says, "Whatever things were written before were written for our learning, that we, through the patience and comfort of the Scriptures, might have hope." Now, there's a doctrine of Scripture contained in that verse. The things that were written before, that is, the Scriptures that have been handed down to us, they were written for our learning and for a practical effect, that through the patience and comfort of them, of the Scriptures, we might have hope. So we come to Genesis 1, and our expectation would be that it is meant so that God's people might understand how He created the world. The issue of the authority of Scripture and the perspicuity of Scripture go together. God's authority, as it expressed in the Scriptures, is something that is clear. And that's part of our doctrine of Scripture, is that we say that the Scripture is meant to be understood. It's meant for our learning. It's meant so that all of God's people can understand the gospel and understand His works, from the least of us to the greatest, to borrow a phrase from the prophet. There are difficult issues in the Scripture and difficult issues in Genesis 1. That's true, but it's meant to be understandable and edifying. So our expectation when we turn to Genesis 1 would not be that the Bible would begin with something of a literary puzzle, that we would immediately open the book and God's first revelation to us would be something extremely difficult to understand, something of a complex and intricate literary nature that the average reader is left baffled by it or simply doesn't see it at all. Or that we would turn to the first chapter of the Bible and right away the Bible would be trading in inaccuracies, if you will, speaking of days where days aren't really envisioned and so on. But our expectation is that is a simple and understandable account of creation that's going to give comfort and hope to God's people. So there is a blessed simplicity to Genesis chapter 1. And it's not our task to go in and try to complicate the obvious, but to learn and to be edified. And the very simplicity of the text may itself be, one of the problems, one of the points of tension that we feel. We feel like it must be more complicated somehow. It must be more difficult than that, in light of the many theories that have arisen, the challenges from outside the church, the scientific, the secular scientific perspective on the origins of the world, and how unbelievably complicated and so on, and then some of the literary perspectives on Genesis 1 that see literary structure and so on, and the many different views that are offered seem, in my words, I don't know how to put it any better, seem to complicate the obvious when it comes to Genesis 1. But the point is, the truth need not be complicated, and our expectation is that we should expect a sharp contrast between the world and the simplicity of the truth as it's revealed in the Scriptures. And I think that's precisely, we see that no more clearly than we see it in Genesis 1, where there is a simple, powerful, majestic passage about how God created the world in 6 days that are delineated by evening and morning. And this march of these 6 days, this majestic sequence, is the very structure of this text. And there is a blessed simplicity to it, in contrast to the many complicating and difficult to grasp theories that compete with it. So the purpose of this text, so that we would understand, so that God's people would know and understand how God created the world. And by understanding that, we would have comfort and hope. All right, let's move on to the next frame here. A plain reading of Genesis 1. Now, I have a quotation up here by James Barr, a Hebrew scholar from the UK. James Barr, a teacher, a Hebrew scholar, an expert who taught in the UK and several different institutions, and even here in the United States. He died a few years ago, I think 5 or 6 years ago. World War II generation, and author of quite a few books on semantics of biblical language, and he also wrote several books wading into the debate on biblical authority and biblical inerrancy. He was a well-known critic of conservative evangelicalism. He wrote a book called The Scope and Authority of the Bible. And in that book, he really launches into authors and scholars such as J.I. Packer, for instance, on the subject of inerrancy. So the reason why I quote him is because I find it fascinating that he would say what he did in this instance. In terms of biblical authority and inerrancy, you might actually consider him a hostile witness, if we could put it that way. But he said, and you can see his quotation here, probably, so far as I know, there's no professor of Hebrew or Old Testament at any world-class university who does not believe that the writer or writers of Genesis 1 through 11 intended to convey to their readers the ideas that, and he listed several ideas, but one of them here is that creation took place in a series of 6 days, which were the same as the days of 24 hours we now experience. I would agree with this quote, that most scholars would say that, number one, but secondly, that was the author's intention, that the reader would come away with the impression that these were 6 literal, sequential 24-hour days that took place in the time span of creation. And as I said, that's because it's the prime and obvious feature of this text. This sequence, this march of 6 days, each of them set off by evening and morning, is the primary feature of the text. And the impression of a sequence of 6 literal days is the obvious point of authorial intent. So it's the obvious intent of the author, and at the same time, it's the primary impression left upon the reader. So many would agree with that, and including James Barr and many others who don't really have any perspective on the authority or inspiration of the Bible. And now I point out this quote, and I make this point about a plain reading of Genesis. What is the primary impression upon the reader? I make this point because I think there's a startling implication to all of this. If we say that the days of Genesis 1 are not really days, whatever they may be, if they are literary constructs, just simply in some literary construction to the text, if they are just a device, a literary device, or if they are, say, long ages, or whatever they may be, if the days of Genesis 1 are not really days, then it's hard not to conclude that the text and its obvious authorial intent and the primary impression it leaves on the reader, that the text itself is, in a sense, deceptive. If the primary impression that it leaves is not the truth that it is trying to convey. So I in my perception, I see it that way. It's a startling implication when we get into theories that go beyond the view that these 6 days are not literal days. Now let's move on to another frame here. This one is just a historical note. The Genesis 1 has been understood by the vast majority of the church as a simple historical narrative until the early 20th century. Now, that's the kind of statement that might get me in trouble. That would be debated and disputed by a lot of people. Because support can be found if you're looking for it for many other views. But I'm talking about the broad sweep of church history. I'm talking about the general consensus of many writers. For instance, Augustine is often claimed by the literary framework camp as being as expressing some of their views in incipient form, I suppose. And I would dispute that. I don't really think that's the case. I think Augustine, when he wrote on Genesis, especially in his book Confessions, was a little more spiritualized the text, sort of allegorized it a little bit. But my point is that you can ferret out, you can find support for different views if you're looking for it. But, however, in my not exhaustive purview of authors on this subject, and again, I haven't read everyone on the subject, obviously, but the church fathers and the reformers and the Puritans that I have surveyed on the subject very often will talk about the 6 days of creation with little elaboration because it was not a widely disputed or contested thing throughout the centuries of church history. What I see more is a broad consensus. And it's not always articulated, but I think it's assumed. A broad consensus on the plain sense of Genesis 1, a plain reading of Genesis 1, and the 6 days of creation being precisely what they seem to be in the text. The Westminster Confession, the catechisms, both catechisms, the larger and the shorter catechism, and the confession, they all use the same language when talking about creation and the days of creation. They say that God created in the space of 6 days, and all very good. And with that, there's no real elaboration, no real qualifications. That's just it, just a very short, succinct statement. And using the same simple language of Genesis chapter 1, honestly, without any qualifications or reservations as to what the days could possibly mean. I've heard some say that it's not a confessional view or a strictly confessional view to say that 6-day creation is the confessional perspective of Westminster. I've heard some say that's not the case, that the lack of elaboration leaves room for other views. I don't really see it that way. I don't think the lack of elaboration is purposeful in order to be ambiguous, in order to allow other views to be subsumed under this language of 6 days. I think it was just a very simple expression, building upon the very simple language of Genesis 1, language that didn't need to be articulated more or elaborated upon more. And that's really the trend I see in a lot of writers as well from that time period. Now, I think this kind of historical consideration is very important. Now, first of all, let me back up and say I surely understand that this just a broad characterization of church history is a dangerous thing. There will always be exceptions, and there will always be some who can point out exceptions. Nevertheless, I think the broad characterization stands. And this is important. I think very important, this historical consideration. Because if we say that there are centuries upon centuries of a concurrence, even a consensus of our perspective on creation, or the church's perspective on creation, many of the other views that we see today that are held in varying degrees of popularity are very new things. unknown to the church in centuries past. And so I, for one, am always wary of perspectives on a passage like this that arise only in the last 50 or 100 years, in the last few generations. So that historical consideration, I think, is very important. Right alongside of that, I think there's also a pastoral question to ask here. And that is, we may wonder if the faith and the life and the witness of the church and our view of biblical authority, have these things been strengthened by these alternate views of creation? Or to ask the question in a different way, was the faith of our fathers in ages past, in church history, was their faith poorer because of a literal, simple view of Genesis chapter 1? And so I'm wondering, has our faith really been built? Has our view of biblical authority, has it been nurtured and built by these competing views? And I think the answer to that question may well be that it has not. But in fact, maybe the opposite is true. All right, let's move along here. Let's get to the next frame. And I promised you a consideration of a few points here on why this perspective still commends itself today. And let me get to the right page in my notes. Okay. That the creation account has all the features of Old Testament historical narrative. Now, as I mentioned, differing views of creation will posit different things about Genesis 1. For instance, the literary framework theory says this is not a literal historical narrative, but rather it's the text is meant to be understood in a different way. Its literary features are what is primary, but it's not to be seen as sequential, literal narrative history. And other theories as well. Day-age theory, for one, looks at the days of Genesis as being long ages, and the gap theory and so on, positing a long stretch of time in between the first creative act in creating the heavens and the earth, and then the days that follow. Those two views that I just mentioned have kind of fallen out of favor, and the literary framework theory is more at the forefront today. But I want to point out just a few things of how the creation account in Genesis 1 has all the features of Old Testament historical narrative. That is to say, it looks and feels and reads like historical narrative, like Genesis 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and so on, and how there is no seam in between these accounts that give us any indication, okay, we're dealing with something different in Genesis 1, something poetic, something less than historical. But when we get to Genesis 2 and Genesis 3, then we're dealing with something historical. And by the way, Genesis 2 and 3 are just as disputed as Genesis 1. Some people would say not only are the days of Genesis 1 a literary construct, but Adam himself is a literary construct, that he wasn't a real singular flesh and blood human being, but he's sort of a representative man, a literary figure. So this kind of perspective on the Scripture continues to encroach into new territory. But let me get to some of these features here. One is the use of the vav consecutive in the narrative sequence of verbs. And let me explain that for you. The vav consecutive is simply a feature of Hebrew narrative that it's often translated just "and" in a English text. And if you read Genesis 1, you'll see the text is peppered with and. Most of the sentences begin with "and." That's the vav consecutive at work. And what it is, it's a conjunction that's used in order to link verbs together in a narrative sequence. And it's very characteristic of Hebrew narrative. However, it's not characteristic of other genres, of poetic genres, of the other genres of Scripture, but it's very characteristic of Hebrew narrative. And Genesis 1 is full of this, and it links sentence to sentence, verb to verb within the sentences. But in the broader picture, it also links Genesis 1 to Genesis 2. It links together the whole text into one cohesive whole, one continuous story, one continuous account, I should say. And so if we were dealing with something other than narrative history, this feature, I believe, would not be present. It would not be as predominant as it is. The second point, the use of the accusative particle that marks direct objects. Once again, this is a feature of Hebrew narrative, and not so much a feature of poetic texts or texts that do not have that narrative style to them, or that narrative structure to them, as Genesis 1 does. Now, this accusative particle is just a little Hebrew word et. That's how it's pronounced, and it's not translatable. It's not something that appears in an English translation, because all it is a sign of a direct object. It marks a direct object in a sentence. And as I said, it's characteristic of narrative and not poetic text. Listen to it in the first sentence of Genesis 1:1. The sentence says, Breshit bara Elohim et hashemayim ve'et haaretz. And you heard et hashemayim ve'et haaretz. That's the particle that I'm talking about there, marking the direct object, in this case hashemayim, the heavens, and haaretz, the earth. And so Genesis 1 is marked full of these particles. Once again, a feature of narrative accounts that are to be taken as historical narratives. And thirdly, no dependence on parallelism as in poetic texts. Poetic texts are dominated by parallelism in the Bible. If you look at the Psalms, for instance, and other wisdom literature, particularly the Proverbs and so on, parallelism is the dominant feature. Parallelism is the backbone of poetic texts in the Old Testament. And what it is, basically, it's a single thought with two thrusts, two lines that thrust one idea or build upon an idea or show you a contrast or something like that. And it is the bread and butter of Old Testament poetry, of poetic text, which is lacking, entirely lacking in Genesis 1 and following in the narrative. Now, I put, for example, Psalm 104 down there because Psalm 104, to my mind, is a very important text in this discussion. Psalm 104 is a poetic description of creation. It's a wonderful text. It's a marvelous, marvelous psalm where the psalmist goes through and going through the order of creation, that is day by day, and the order in which God created things. He goes through the psalm and he praises God for each one of those things, all the different features of creation. But it's obvious this is poetic style. This is non-narrative style. And you can read Psalm 104, the parallelism, the increased use of metaphor and imagery, and just the very dense kind of poetic language that's very rich, which we know so well from the Psalms. That's what Psalm 104 is all about. And it's a magnificent psalm. But there is an example of a non-literal, non-narrative account of creation. So the Bible gives us an example of this, and it's Psalm 104. So that's an important point of the discussion as well. All right, let me move along to the next frame here and talk about the use of day in Genesis 1 in its plain sense. Now, as I said, when the days of Genesis are seen as either merely a literary structure, a literary convention, as in the literary framework hypothesis, or in other theories, as I said, they're seen as other things, as long ages and so on. So what is the day in Genesis 1? Well, I believe it's being used in its plain sense. The very thing that James Barr said in that quote earlier, that he's conveying to the readers that these are days as we understand them, as we experience them in 24 hours, delineated by evening and morning. That's the first point. Evening and morning are used consistently in reference to literal days. Now, I might add this point, that nowhere else in the Bible, as far as I can tell, nowhere else are days used as a literary construct. Now, there are ways in which the word day is used that a literal 24-hour day is not intended, where a time period or just a point in history is intended. That's very true. But days, a structure of days or a sequence of days being used as a literary structure is pretty unprecedented, and I don't think there are any other examples of it really that we can point to. But whenever you attach evening and morning to the word day and the use of day, you've pretty much defined in text, in context, you've defined what you mean by the use of the word day. Because only a literal day as God created them in the first week and as God has created them ever since. Only a day, a 24-hour day, begins with morning and ends with evening. And I might add, ages are never referenced this way either. Ages don't begin with the morning, and they do not end with an evening. The second point is numerical qualifiers not used in a non-literal day reference. Numerical qualifiers, meaning in Genesis 1 you have the second day, third day, fourth day, the ordinal numbers that are attached to the day references. And they are not used in any case in non-literal day references. When you can enumerate the days, the first, the second, the third, the fourth, you're talking about a sequence of time in every other instance. So again, it would be unprecedented to have a sequential first, second, third, fourth day, and the referent not being two sequential days. I might add that the Hebrew word echad as one, which is one, and yom echad is the first day. It's often translated as an ordinal. It's often translated the first day, right? That was what God did on the first day. But echad is not. It's not ordinarily used in that sense. It's a cardinal number, and I've seen it translated this way, and this may well be a better translation that gives a good sense of what's being said. Yom echad can and perhaps ought to be translated either day one or one day. Now that would be a pretty striking statement. It was evening and it was morning one day. I've seen Jewish texts that Jewish translations that translate it that way, and that brings out the striking intention of evening and morning a little bit more clearly and firmly, I think. So that's something to consider. The third point here, Genesis 1 uses day as an independent singular noun. The figurative or poetic use of day is usually in a bound grammatical construction. Now, what I mean by bound grammatical construction is the Hebrew word yom, or day, will be used in a sequence of words that is called a construct chain. And to put that simply, what it means is a day of something. Usually it's in that kind of construction, a grammatical construction where it doesn't sort of stand on its own, but it's in this sequence of words that is called a construct chain. Now, for instance, just to show you what I mean, there is such a use of day in Genesis 2, verse 4, where it says, and I'll just read it in Hebrew, Elech toledot hashemayim v'haaretz behibraam beyom asot Adonai Elohim eretz v'shemayim. Now, this, just to translate, this is the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created. Now, this phrase, B'yom asot Adonai Elohim, literally, in the day of the Lord God's making them. You could put it that way. That's what I mean by a bound grammatical construction. In the day of their making. So there is a use of the word day that is not literal. It's talking about the time period of creation, but it's in this kind of construction. And broadly speaking, when you have the use of the word day in instances like that, that are non-literal, that are either sort of a literary, a time marker, if you will, or a generalized kind of reference, they will be in this kind of construct. Another instance is the phrase, the day of the Lord, which is a very important phrase in prophetic books, right? But it's the same thing. But in Genesis 1, these days are independent singular nouns. They are not in these constructions. Lastly, finally, on this frame, the plain meaning of day in Genesis 1 provides the logic behind the fourth commandment. I really think this is an important point to consider. I think this is very big, actually. The very basis of time, the very structure of our weeks, the structure of our experience itself, the flow of time itself. You know, time is one of the things that God created in the first week. On the first day, He created the first day. He created time. And He created time to follow a certain structure, and that our experience would be of that structure. And it is patterned on a literal view of this week in 7 sequential days. And that is the reason annexed to the fourth commandment in Exodus 20 is, you remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And the reason is for, and there's a purpose clause that connects it. The reason why is for, in 6 days the Lord created the heavens, the earth, the sea, that all is in them. Now, it's the reason annexed to the fourth commandment. And we have to ask, wouldn't the fourth commandment lose not only its logic, but its power if it called for a literal pattern of life to be based upon a figurative structure of creation? Can a literal pattern of life be really based on a figurative structure of creation? So for that reason, I say so much hinges upon the creation week and how we understand it. Our pattern, our weekly pattern of work and rest, that is a divine pattern to imitate. And the seventh day, the Sabbath day, which is so vastly important in the Scriptures as a sign of the covenant, a means of grace, all of these things. The work by which we pattern our lives and imitate God on 6 days, and the seventh day, which is a perpetual sign between Him and us, and a type of that great rest to come, that eternal rest to come. Are these built upon just a literary construct? Are they built upon a fiction? That's the question that bothers me when it comes to these different views of creation that take away the literal structure, the literal basis of the first week. All right. Wow, time moves more quickly than I realized here. So let's move on here, and I'll try to get through these last several frames. I've been referencing the literary framework hypothesis, and I'll just try to briefly describe it here. It sees the days of Genesis 1 as a poetic structure with 2 triads of creations. There's a misprint here. With 2 triads of creation acts that correspond to each other. I apologize for that misprint. 2 triads of creation acts that correspond to each other. And I have it demonstrated here. It's not quite demonstrated here. I had hoped the frames would have lined up 1, 2, 3, day 1, 2, 3 on the left side, and day 4, 5, 6 on the right-hand side. Because in the literary framework hypothesis, day 1 corresponds to day 4, where light and darkness are separated, and day 4, where the sun and the moon and the stars are created to carry on the separation of light and darkness. Day 2 corresponds to day 5, the sky and the waters separated, and then day 5, the fish and birds to inhabit those domains. Day 3, dry land and sea separated, corresponds to day 6, where the animals and man inhabit those domains. So just to break it down simply, the first 3 days are the creation of different kingdoms, if you will. This is to use the language of Meredith Kline in his description of this theory on Genesis 1. The first 3 days create the kingdoms, these 3 different kingdoms, and days 4, 5, and 6 create the kings that rule those kingdoms, if you will. So the first 3 days correspond to the last 3 days in terms of kingdoms and their kings. And again, this is the language and really the construction of it, according to Meredith Kline. Very renowned scholar, died several years ago, 5-6 years ago, but very well-renowned Old Testament scholar. Wrote several things on this, the literary framework theory, several journal articles, and longer writings as well. But this doesn't capture the whole thing. This is a oversimplification of it. There's a deeper, very more complicated aspect to the literary framework hypothesis. Klein talked about a two-register cosmology where God created the heavens as one realm above and the earth as a lower realm, and the acts of creation that took place in the upper realm had their expression in the lower realm, not in a literal sequence of days, but in this sort of framework, this literary structure of these days, which were not literal days, but something else. It's very quite complicated, actually, and some of the language is difficult to understand, sometimes esoteric at points, and in my mind, very far removed from the simple language of Genesis 1. But this is at least a visualization and a very quick description of what the literary framework hypothesis is about. And I don't mean to not do it justice. I just have time constraints here. But this is a perspective on Genesis 1 that is gaining in popularity in the evangelical world and in the Reformed world. There are many good men, many good people who do embrace this theory. I'm not one of them, as you can tell. However, it is growing in its reach and in its popularity. Let me move on to the next frame. And just a summarizing comment here, this structure, as illustrated in the previous frame there, is helpful in showing the orderly nature of creation. But in no way does it suggest that Genesis 1 is anything but a historical account of 6 literal days. There are narrative texts, many of them, historical narrative texts that have clear patterns and structures to them. This is one of them. I mean, you look at the first 3 days and the second group of 3 days and the acts of creation that took place on them. I think it's helpful to look at the structure in this way and to see the orderly nature of it and to see the corresponding nature of the days, 1 to 4, 2 to 5, 3 to 6. I mean, it does make some sense. It does reveal the orderliness and the structure of the creation as an act of God. He is a God of order. But it is non sequitur to go from there and say, well, because there is this literary structure, then that's what the text is. Instead, I would say if there is structure here, it's because creation itself was poetry in motion. It was a true historical act in these 6 days that God created. And if we find structure to them, all the more praise to God. It's a structured, orderly, historical event that takes place. But it does not follow that because there is literary structure, there is no chronological structure or historical basis to the text, or what I'm saying is the historical narrative basis to the text. There are many other texts that are like this in the Bible. I think of a couple examples. The 10 plagues that are mentioned in the book of Exodus that God brought on Egypt. A highly structured text. The 10 plagues come in 3 triads of 3 groups of 3. And the first of each group, the plague is announced in the morning. The second plague in each group is announced at Pharaoh's house. And the third plague in each group comes without warning. And that's the cycle. It goes 3 times over. And there are other structures to the text too. So we find 3 sets of 3 that these plagues follow a pattern. And then the 10th one is the crowning, of course, the most terrible of all. But we would not look at that text and say, well, that means it's not literal. It's not historical, that the 10 plagues are just a literary framework without any real chronological sequence. It is real history. It is real historical narrative. There happens to be a structure to it. I think it is helpful to see this kind of structure, but it isn't the the sort of the be all end all of what Genesis 1 is all about. All right, I'm going to move along here to the next frame and the next point. Just a suggestion here that the correspondence of these days, as I tried to demonstrate them in 2 frames ago, that is the correspondence between day 1, 3, day 2 and 4, and day 3 and 6. The correspondence of these days is not as exact as some would suggest. For instance, the correspondence between day 2 and day 5 is not precise, because the preparation of a place for the birds and fish, which were created on day 5, does not come on day 2. Just parenthetically, I might say day 2 is when the waters above were divided from the waters below. But rather, their place, their kingdom, if you will, their home was established on day 3. Not until day 3 does God gather the waters and call them seas, in verse 10 of the text. On day 5, the fish are commanded to fill the waters in the seas. Verses 26 and 28 further mention the fish of the sea, giving repetitive emphasis to the fact that the realm they inhabit was expressly created on the 3rd day. So the fish created on the 5th day belong to the place prepared for them on the 3rd day. This is one example of how the nice tidy structure of the literary framework theory, to my mind, can be challenged. It isn't exactly evident to everyone, and certainly not to me. It's not as exact as some might think it is. Okay, I'm going to move along here. We're a little past time in terms of content, but just a couple more frames. And again, just another summarizing statement here. The literary framework hypothesis misses the plain sense and historic understanding of this text, which, in its majestic simplicity, provides the foundational revelation of God's character through his awesome work of creation. That's a summarizing statement for this thought. I think our discussion, our writing, our commentating, our preaching on Genesis 1 has suffered a shift in focus because it has become a literary battleground. Now we talk about its literary features and the meaning of the days and so on and so forth. That's what Genesis 1 has almost become. To our detriment and to its detriment, this text is about God. It is a text that reveals him through his works, and I hate to see that clouded over by the controversy surrounding it. It is a magnificent text that is so meaningful and consequential to the faith and the life of God's people. Such devotional depth to this text too. I recently preached several sermons on Genesis 1 and also led some Bible studies on Genesis 1 as well. And just the devotional depth of this passage, not even really dealing with these kinds of issues, but the devotional depth of this passage, just amazing. It just amazes me. It's a text that I just naturally gravitate toward. And I would say that Genesis 1 is a text that is about God and his nature. That's what Genesis 1 is about. Some may look at it as just a naive, man-centered, world-centered view of creation. Something that the scientists scoff at and think very naive. Well, they're bound to think that. They're bound to say that. But it is a text that is about God, and to read it with any other interest or any other agenda is ultimately to misread it, I think. God and his character is what this wonderful text is all about. It teaches us about his eternality, about his triunity, about his pleasure in doing and enjoying that which is good. That's what this whole march of the days is about, that God paused in each day and saw that it was good, and he was enjoying the process of creating this good work that he pronounced very good at the end. So it reveals the goodness of God. It's about his goodness. And he took his time. God can instantly create anything he wants, but he chose to take 6 days as a pattern and a model for us, but also to enjoy creating and doing that which is good. God took pleasure in that process. And as he does in all of history, as he does in our lives. He can accomplish his ends immediately if he wants to. He has perfect efficiency because he has perfect power. But he chose 6 days, just as he chooses to take time to save and to sanctify us and so on, because of the pleasure he takes in the process of his own good work. And my mind goes back to Psalm 104, the end of Psalm 104, where it says, "May God rejoice in his works." And that's what Genesis 1 is. There's no people on the scene. There's just God and his creation. And the whole text is about God rejoicing in his works of creation before there was even a man or a woman on the scene. So that's what the text is about. And I hate to see it obscured by controversy, but it's really deep and really magnificent when you approach it at that level. Okay. Our time is drawing near to be finished. So, last frame says finally on top. Finally. Creation itself and the historical account of it is an awe-inspiring call to worship. We truly understand Genesis 1 when we are led to the conclusion of Psalm 104. The psalmist, upon reviewing the whole work of creation as it is ordered in Genesis 1, exclaimed, "I will sing to the Lord as long as I live. I will sing praise to my God while I have my being." This is the right application of Genesis 1. We sometimes miss that point, I fear, that we're busy in the contest of what it means and what it says, but what do we do with it? How do we apply it? I think Psalm 104 tells us precisely what is the application of Genesis 1 and what role general revelation plays in the Christian life. That is really something to consider. You know, we talk often about the role of special revelation in the Christian's life. We're always exhorted to read our Bibles and how it's a means of grace. But what is the role of general revelation in the Christian life? The role of it is to instill within us a sense of awe and wonder that leads to worship. You read Psalm 104. And so I look at Genesis 1, not only Genesis 1, I look at the world around us as a call to worship. And so that's why this text has a deep attraction and significance to the faith and life of every believer. It is the second greatest miracle, according to Augustine, as I mentioned before, besides the resurrection. And we live right in the midst of it. It's all around us. When you look up, you see it. When you step on the ground, you're stepping on it. Everywhere you go, you live right in the midst of it. And the contemplation of creation really brings us back to fundamental thoughts. Genesis 1 brings us back to fundamental things. The origin and purpose of the world in our lives, the relationship of God to his world and his people, in the sense of awe and wonder that leads to worship. Psalm 8 is another great example of how Genesis 1 and its subject matter can be and should be applied to the Christian life, where the psalmist looked at the heavens and everything in them, and it gave him a sense of his own smallness and a sense of God's bigness. Okay, well, that brings us right up to 4 o'clock, it seems. And I suppose I'll look over here to Mark and ask him to give me some direction on the next portion here.
All right, we have some questions coming in, and this is the time for you to use your chat box in that lower left-hand corner. And we'll talk here for a minute just to give Professor Williams an opportunity to take a look at the first question. Then I have some more spooling up from him. Again, we just give thanks to Reformed Presbyterian Missions. It's their work that allows us to use this software and reach you today. So we will continue here with some more questions and answers.
Okay, I am back for a time for question and answer. And the first question that Mark handed to me comes from Bob Hemphill. Bob says his question is, in regard to the simple quotation in the confessional documents of the words of Genesis. The question is, would the lack of elaboration in the confession and catechism on creation run parallel to the lack of elaboration on eschatology in the confessional documents, and therefore be meant to not nail down the details, but allow for some different interpretations and points of view? All right, this is a good question, and I can't claim to be an expert on the confession and the authors of it. I am at least a student of the confession, as I am a student of Genesis 1. But I'll tell you what I think, and that's all I can do. I believe that already in the context of a well-established differentiation of opinion in eschatology by the time of the confession, and in that time period, there's obviously already been quite a lot of differences and controversy and a variance of opinion on eschatology. That was sort of a well-known, well-understood field in which there were differences of opinion that were all held to be legitimate, and no one wanted to sort of be shut out because of an eschatological opinion. But the context, I think, would be a bit different, because as far as I know, there was not the same sort of context of controversy or a fragmentation of opinions when it came to creation in that same historical context. So that would be my first response to that, Bob, and hopefully that might be a helpful reply. I'm not sure. I hope I got to the heart of your question, but that would be my general perspective on that. All right, I've got another question here, and this one is, it's not a question. It's a statement. I'll read the statement. From David Purcell. The majesty of our great God is clearly demonstrated in Genesis 1. To try to imagine the greatness of God is beyond our human capacity. He put the stars in place, and according to a precise mathematical formula that caused the star to hover over Bethlehem at that precise time that the Magi arrived, following it from the east. Very true. He ordered the blood moon to rise on precisely the day his son died on the cross. How magnificent is our God. Well, indeed, David, very true. That's just the kind of awe and wonder that creation, Genesis 1, the account of it, and the reality of it. When you step outside into the sunshine, every time the sun hits your face, we are to remember that first magnificent word of God, let there be light. And to remember the gospel of Christ, who is the light of the world. Our world is full of, everywhere you look is a reminder of His majesty and His power and the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that's what creation is. It is one enormous sermon illustration, one big object lesson about the majesty and the power and the goodness of God. And that, I think, is what I was getting at when I talked about the right use of Genesis 1, or the right application of it. Okay, well, we are after 4 o'clock, and I want to thank you for tuning in. I am not seeing any questions popping up on the screen, but let me conclude by saying, if you want to interact with me further, if you have anything that you would like to run past me, you can get in touch with me by email, which is available at the RPTS website. You can always contact me through there. So once again, thank you for tuning in. I hope it was useful to you. I appreciate it. And have a blessed day. Thank you.
And we do thank you for participating today. You'll see on the screen next month, May 3rd, we have Dr. Mark Garcia, adjunct professor here at RPTS, and his topic will be a Reformed theology of justification. So Always remember, first Thursday of every month, we have something going on here in the webinar series. You'll find a link for this on our website, and God bless you through the rest of today.